Welcome to my YouTube channel at Sci-Fi Tales Pools. Please subscribe, like, and share to support my channel. Queen Alara stood on the balcony of the Grand Palace, looking over the hills and rivers that stretched far into the distance. The morning sun painted the sky in soft gold, and the sound of bells rang through the city below. Today was the day she would wed Ethan Hale, a man who had never been part of court life, a man with no noble family name. Many in the palace whispered that this marriage was strange. Some even thought it was foolish. Ethan had grown up on a farm in the quiet countryside. He was known for his hard work and calm nature, but little else. He was not a soldier. He was not a scholar. He had no stories of battle or grand adventures. When Alara first met him, she noticed how he listened more than he spoke, and how his eyes seemed to see more than he let on. There was a stillness in him that made her curious. The wedding ceremony was held in the Great Hall. Sunlight streamed through tall stained glass windows, making colors dance across the marble floor. Alara wore a gown of white silk, her crown resting lightly on her head. Ethan stood beside her, dressed simply but neatly, his expression calm. As they exchanged vows, he spoke in a soft voice that carried more weight than its volume. His hand was warm when it held hers, and she felt an odd sense of safety. The court watched with mixed feelings. Some smiled politely, others barely hid their frowns. Alara could feel the judgment in the air, but she chose to ignore it. She had made her choice. After the ceremony, they walked through the gardens, where roses and lilies bloomed in full color. Ethan said little, commenting only on the beauty of the flowers and the sound of the birds. In the days that followed, life in the palace continued as before, though now Ethan was part of it. He rose early each morning, walking the gardens alone before breakfast. He spent hours in the library, reading quietly, or stood on the balcony, looking out at the city. He spoke politely to the servants and nodded respectfully to the guards. Yet he never pushed himself into court discussions or tried to gain attention. Alara began to notice small things about him, the way he always seemed to be watching the room, as if noting every detail, the way he moved quietly, his steps almost without sound. Once when a servant dropped a tray, Ethan caught it before it hit the floor, quick as lightning. He laughed it off, but Alara could not forget how fast he had been. One evening, they dined alone in a small chamber lit by candlelight. Alara asked him if he missed the countryside. He smiled faintly and said that the air there was cleaner, the nights quieter. She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone told her he was not ready to share everything. She decided not to press him. The people in the court began to talk more. Some said Ethan was boring, that he had nothing to offer a queen. Others said it was nice to have someone calm and steady beside her. Alara kept her thoughts to herself, but she found herself watching him more closely. He was quiet, yes, but there was a strength in that quiet. One morning, while walking together in the courtyard, a young page rushed up with a message. The king of a neighboring land was making demands over disputed territory far from the capital. Alara frowned at the news, knowing it could mean trouble. Ethan listened, but said nothing. Still, she noticed his jaw tighten ever so slightly. As the days passed, the matter of the disputed land began to stir unrest. Alara held council meetings to discuss the situation. Akeda attended some of them but remained in the background. He sat still, his eyes moving from speaker to speaker, as if weighing each word. When one of the visiting envoys made a rude remark about Alara, Ethan looked up sharply. He did not speak, but the envoy quickly avoided his gaze. That night, as Alara prepared for bed, she thought about her new husband. He was not like anyone she had known before. He did not try to impress her or others, yet there was something in him that seemed solid, unshakable. She felt as if he was a mountain hidden in the mist, and she wondered what would happen if that mist ever cleared. For now, she let the questions rest. She would wait, watch, and see. The quiet man she had married was still a mystery, but one she was willing to learn, no matter how long it took. The days after the wedding passed quietly, but trouble was growing beyond the palace walls. Reports came in from traders and messengers about tensions with the kingdom to the east. It began with small disputes over mining rights on a far-off asteroid colony, but the words from the east grew sharper each day. Soon, the threat of war was whispered in the corridors. Queen Alara held long meetings with her council. She listened to her generals speak about the strength of their armies and the cost of bringing in mercenaries from distant lands. Some believed they could not win without outside help. Others thought the enemy would not dare to attack. The room was always full of loud voices and heated arguments. Ethan attended the meetings but stayed in the background. He did not try to speak over the others. Instead, he sat still and watched. His eyes moved from person to person, listening to every word. Most of the lords and advisors hardly noticed him. They thought of him as the quiet husband of the queen, someone without influence in matters of war. One afternoon, a messenger arrived during a council meeting, his clothes dusty from travel. Brought a letter from the Eastern King. It was filled with sharp words and demands. He claimed that the disputed land belonged to him, and that Alara must give it up, or face the consequences. The letter was read aloud in the council chamber. A tall envoy from the east, who had been invited to the court to keep peace, spoke next. He smiled as he questioned Alara's judgment, and called her a young queen who should listen to stronger rulers. The words were meant to insult her in front of her own people. Ethan's eyes lifted from the table. He looked directly at the envoy, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to grow still. He said nothing, but the envoy shifted uncomfortably and avoided his gaze. Alara noticed, though she kept her own face calm. Later that day, Alara found Ethan in the palace gardens, sitting under the shade of an old tree. She walked over and sat beside him. The air was warm, and the scent of flowers filled the space between them. "You did not say much in the meeting," she said. Ethan shrugged. "There was nothing to add. They've already made their plans." "And what do you think of those plans?" she asked. "I think they are preparing for the wrong kind of fight," he said quietly. "The enemy will not wait for us to be ready." She looked at him, wondering how he could speak with such certainty. "You sound like someone who has been in this situation before." Ethan glanced toward the tall hedges and said nothing more. She could see there was more he was not saying, but she let the silence remain. In the following days, tension in the capital grew. The markets were busy with people buying supplies. Soldiers trained harder in the yards, their shouts and the clash of steel filling the air. Families began storing food, fearing what might come. Ethan kept his same calm routine. He walked the gardens, read in the library, and moved quietly through the halls. Yet Alara noticed that he now visited the training grounds more often. He watched the soldiers practice and spoke briefly with the captains. Sometimes, she saw him studying the city walls from the highest tower. One evening, during a smaller council meeting, the news came that the Eastern Kingdom had begun moving troops toward the border. The generals argued about whether to send forces now or wait. The debate grew louder, voices clashing like swords. Ethan stood near the far wall, silent as always. But when one advisor spoke about surrendering the disputed land to avoid war, Ethan's hand curled into a fist at his side. His face stayed calm, yet Alara noticed the small sign of anger. After the meeting ended, Alara walked with Ethan back to their private chambers. "You disagreed with what was said," she remarked. "Yes," he replied simply. "Why?" "Because giving up the land will not stop them. We'll only invite them to take more." Alara stopped in the hallway and looked at him. His voice was quiet, but there was no doubt in it. For the first time, she wondered if her husband, the quiet man who had seemed so distant from the matters of war, might hold answers her generals did not. That night, as she lay awake, she thought about his words and the way he carried himself. There was something steady and unshaken about Ethan, even as the threat of war grew closer. She still did not know his full story, but she began to feel that, when the time came, he would not stand by in silence. The enemy came sooner than anyone had expected. At dawn, the sound of warning bells spread across the city. People rushed to the streets, and soldiers gathered at the walls. The eastern forces had moved under the cover of night, and were already at the gates of the capital. Queen Alara stood in the great hall with her generals, trying to keep her voice calm as they planned their defense. The air was tense, filled with the smell of burning oil and the distant shouts of soldiers. The sound of clashing steel echoed from beyond the palace walls. Ethan entered the hall quietly. He was not dressed for battle, wearing only a plain tunic and boots. He moved to stand beside Alara without a word. One of the generals glanced at him with doubt, thinking he was only there to comfort the queen. The palace doors shook as enemy soldiers forced their way in. Guards rushed to block them, swords drawn, but the attackers were many and well armed. In the chaos, a tall enemy commander broke through the line, look, his eyes locked on Alara, and he raised his sword. Ethan stepped forward. His hand moved to the sword of a fallen guard, lifting it as if it belonged to him all along. The steel flashed in the morning light. Without hesitation, he met the commander head-on. The first strike was fast and clean, forcing the commander back. Ethan moved with a strange mixture of grace and power, each motion precise. His steps were light, yet his strikes carried force that broke through defenses. The guards nearest to him stopped to watch, their surprise clear. This was not the fighting of an untrained man. The commander tried to press forward again, swinging his sword toward Alara. Ethan blocked the blow with such speed that the sound rang through the hall like a bell, turned the block into a counterattack, striking the commander's sword arm and forcing him to drop his weapon. In the next moment, the commander was on the floor, defeated. Silence filled the great hall. The remaining enemy soldiers looked at each other, then began to retreat, pulling the wounded commander with them. The palace guards quickly closed the doors and secured them. Ethan stood still, his sword lowered, but ready. His breathing was steady, as if the fight had cost him little. The generals stared at him, their expressions a mix of respect and confusion. Alara stepped closer, her eyes fixed on her husband. "You fight like a man who has seen many battles," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "There was a time when I did." Before she could ask more, a captain approached, bowing to both of them. "The enemy is pulled back from the palace, but they still hold the outer streets. We will need to push them out." Ethan nodded once and handed the sword back to the nearest guard. Without another word, he turned and left the hall. Lara followed him into the courtyard, where soldiers were gathering to defend the palace grounds. She watched as Ethan spoke to a small group of guards, showing them how to position their shields and when to strike. His voice was calm, his instructions clear. The men listened as if they had known him for years. Within minutes, they moved into the formation he had described. From the palace steps, Alara saw the change in the battle. The guards moved with more coordination, pushing the enemy back step by step. Ethan fought alongside them, his movements quick and sure. Each strike he made seemed to open space for another soldier to advance. When the enemy finally began to retreat from the streets, the city erupted in cheers. Soldiers clapped each other on the back, and the people watching from windows waved in relief. Ethan returned to the palace, his tunic marked with dust and a few cuts, but his expression as calm as ever. Alara stepped toward him. "You saved more than my life today. You saved this city." Ethan shook his head. "The soldiers did their duty. I only did what I had to." But Alara knew there was more to it than that. She had seen the way he moved, the way he had led without hesitation. The quiet man she had married was no ordinary husband. He was someone forged by battle, someone who had chosen silence over glory. And now she wondered how much longer that silence would last. The night after the battle, the palace was quiet again. The fires in the streets had been put out, and the sound of cheering had faded into the soft hum of the city, settling back into uneasy rest. Queen Alara sat in her private chamber, waiting for Ethan to return from speaking with the captains. When he finally entered, she rose to meet him. He still wore the same plain tunic from earlier, but his hands were clean, and his eyes were steady. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You fought today like a man who has done it 100 times before," she said. Ethan looked at her, then glanced toward the window where the moonlight spilled across the floor. "That is because I have," he replied softly. Alara walked closer, searching his face. "Then tell me who you are, truly. No more silence, no more mystery."
Ow.
For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he sighed and moved to sit by the window. She followed, sitting across from him. "Before I came here," he began, "I served in the frontier wars. I was part of a unit that never fought in open fields. We were trained for close combat, for moving quietly behind enemy lines, for ending fights before they began. We did the work no one talked about." Alara listened without interrupting. "I left because I was tired of killing," Ethan continued. "I had seen too much blood, too many people lost for reasons that no longer made sense to me. I walked away and went home to the countryside. I wanted nothing more than to live in peace. And then you married me," Alara said quietly. "Yes," he answered. "I did not plan for it. I only knew that when I met you, you seemed different from the world I had left behind. I thought I could be your husband without being a soldier again." She lowered her eyes for a moment. But when the palace was attacked, you fought without hesitation. Ethan nodded. Because it was you. And because this is your home, your people. I could not stand aside. Silence filled the room for a while. The light of the moon made his face look calm, but she could see the weight in his eyes. She knew he was telling the truth. Do you regret leaving that life? Not for a moment, he said. But I know that once you have learned to fight, it never leaves you. You can bury it, but it waits. And when the time comes, it will return. The next day, word of Ethan's skill in battle had already spread through the city. Soldiers spoke of the way he had moved, and merchants repeated stories they had heard from guards. Even children in the streets pretended to be the quiet man who had stood against the enemy commander. In the council meeting, the generals treated Ethan differently. They asked his opinion on the enemy's next move, gave short answers, never speaking more than needed. When they pressed him for details, he explained how the Eastern Army would regroup and likely try a different approach. Alara watched him carefully. It was clear that he understood the enemy better than anyone else in the room. The generals seemed both impressed and uneasy. That evening, Alara joined him in the gardens. The air was cool, and the sound of water from the fountain filled the space between them. The people are talking about you, she said. Let them talk, he replied. They see you as a hero. Ethan looked at the water. Heroes are 4 stories. I'm only a man who did what had to be done. She smiled faintly. And yet, you have given them hope. He met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something like uncertainty there. Hope can be dangerous, he said. Lara shook her head. Hope can win wars. They stood there for a while, neither speaking. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang to mark the hour. Lara knew the days ahead would not be peaceful. The enemy would return. But now, she also knew she had someone beside her who would not falter when the time came. Ethan might have left the life of a soldier, but when her kingdom needed him, he would stand again. And she would be ready to stand with him. The days after the battle were busy for the whole kingdom. Streets were being cleaned, damaged walls repaired, and the people tried to return to their lives. But the shadow of the enemy still hung over the city. No one believed the war was over. Queen Alara met with her council every morning. They spoke about supplies, defenses, and how to keep the people calm. The Eastern Kingdom had not sent another attack yet, but scouts reported that their forces were gathering again near the border. Ethan kept his quiet routine, but now the palace guards looked at him with respect. They greeted him with a firm nod when he passed. In the training yard, young soldiers came to watch him move through sword drills. He did not boast or try to impress them, but he corrected their stance, showed them how to block, and taught them to wait for the right moment before striking. One afternoon, Alara stood at a balcony and watched him in the courtyard. His voice was low but steady as he explained a move to a group of recruits. The sun caught the edge of his sword, and she felt again that strange mix of peace and strength he carried. That evening, as they walked together in the gardens, she told him, "You have changed how the soldiers see themselves. They believe they can win." Ethan shook his head. "They must believe in themselves, not in me. I will not always be here to fight for them. But you will fight if the time comes again," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes, if it comes, I will." A week later, news arrived that the Eastern Kingdom wanted to meet and speak of peace. The council was divided. Some thought it was a trap. Others believed it was a chance to end the threat without more bloodshed. Alara decided to accept the meeting, but she ordered the city to be ready in case of betrayal. On the day of the meeting, the Eastern envoys arrived at the palace gates. They were dressed in fine clothes, but their faces were guarded. In the great hall, the air was heavy with tension. Alara sat on her throne, Ethan standing quietly at her side. The lead envoy spoke of peace, of trade, and of avoiding future conflict. His words were smooth, but Ethan listened closely. When the envoy promised to pull troops back from the border, Ethan stepped forward and spoke for the first time during the talks. "If you mean what you say, then do it before the week ends," he said calmly. "Words mean nothing until they are done." The envoy shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. The talks ended with an agreement, and the Eastern delegation left the city under watch. That night, Alara and Ethan stood together on the palace walls. The city lights glowed below, and the air carried the faint smell of wood smoke. "Do you believe them?" she asked. "No," Ethan said simply. "But if they break their word, we will be ready." Days passed, and reports came that the eastern troops were pulling back as promised. For the first time in weeks, the city began to breathe easier. Merchants opened their shops fully, and children played in the streets again. In the courtyard, Ethan continued to train the guards. His quiet voice guided them through each move, and his steady presence made them work harder. He never acted like a king, but the people spoke of him with pride. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Ilara came to the training yard. She watched as Ethan finished showing a young soldier how to use his shield. When the soldier left, she walked to him. "The kingdom is safer because of you," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "It is safer because of all of us. You lead them, they fight. I only help where I can, and that is enough," she replied. They stood together, watching the last light fade from the sky. The threat was not gone forever, but for now there was peace. Ilara knew that if danger returned, Ethan would stand beside her without hesitation. She had married a quiet man, but in him she had found more than a husband. She had found the protector her kingdom never knew it needed. And for the first time since their wedding day, she truly understood the strength behind his silence. Thank you for watching and being part of our community.